Yeah.
I know you're a very busy man. Maybe we can start today by giving our audience is largely Indian origin, trying to be entrepreneur, the young person under the age of 30, around 25, I would say on average.
Just like you.
I wish I was that young, not anymore, unfortunately. But they all want to figure out what to build, how to start something.
Yeah.
Like you were telling me about your daughters, a lot
Yeah.
of them have a job right now. They want to transition into owning a business. There is a lot of uncertainty about AI and which job will remain, which will not. You speak a lot about jobs. So maybe we start with you and you tell us a bit about your career. I mean, I know a lot about you, but for the few people in our audience who might not, could you start by giving us a couple of minutes on your life, how it began, context?
Sure. So I'm 66, so it began a long time ago compared to the audience you're talking to.
Right.
But my dad was in the army, and we kind of moved every 2-3 years. And, what you would call an army brat in that sense, living a relatively sheltered upbringing because of that surrounding of being in a cantonment with the people who came from a similar background of some type. And then there was an elder sister. She's the eldest, an older brother who was 5 years older than me. So 10, 5, 0, kind of three of us.
Which city was this?
I'm sorry?
Which part of India?
Oh, all over the place. I was born in Pune. And my sister and brother were born, 10 years and 5 years. Earlier, my brother was born in Simla. My sister was born in Delhi. And so they've kind of been all over the place. And then we moved every couple of years. So I started schooling in, my early days in Jhansi, then Jalandhar, and then came to Delhi, and then went to Hyderabad. Then from Hyderabad, went to Simla and finished schooling in Simla. And then did a college in Delhi at the economics in St. Stephen's College.
Right.
And then went to Ahmedabad to do my MBA, which is where I met my wife. And
Right.
we were classmates in business school. And then joined Nestle and worked in Nestle for the better part of 13, 14 years in India, all over the place, moved from Delhi to Mumbai to Calcutta. And then joined PepsiCo to start KFC and Pizza Hut in India at that time. And then left and joined Citibank and spent 14 years with them, starting in India, London, Brussels, London, New York, Hong Kong.
Right.
And then back to New York.
Right.
And then joined MasterCard as CEO, and spent 14 years there, and then now here. I've got there were three of us. My wife also has two siblings and one. So they're all girls in her case. And then we've got two kids, and my kids have kids. So now I got 3 grandkids. So
you spent a fair amount of time at Nestle. Do you see that business model of a large FMCG company selling across the world? Do you think that's breaking? You see a lot of the multiples companies in FMCG are coming down. They've been historically very expensive. Is the consumer moving to independent brands from large conglomerates?
not really.
No?
I think you see that movement began quite some time ago. It started for value at a point of time when it moved to these private labels in the case of some of the larger locations. But in the case of India, for example, Amul was a big breakthrough in milk, right? So you got brands that came up locally, but it's not as though the multinational brands aren't strong and high quality with high perceived advantages. The only difference is in the emerging markets years back, if you were a global multinational brand, you had a halo of which you didn't feel you could get domestically. That certainly has changed. And
Right.
Amul is an example of that. High quality product, whether it's powder or yogurt or desserts or ghee or anything else today, Amul has a product that is as good as anybody else's. And I think that change definitely leads to a lower dominance level for multinationals. But otherwise, the idea of a global company which has global standards but locally executed with great delivery, it's still a very popular model. The issue of earning multiples and share pricing coming down, that's a whole other thing. I think there's a lot going on in the markets where people are putting money into new technologies, new industries, AI, finance. There's a lot of stuff going on and rotating out of certain. What happens invariably in these markets is when there's friction or volatility or instability, you find people rotating back into predictable earning streams. And so industries go through ups and downs in their PE multiples. And part of that you'll see in what you just asked.
Do you think consumer behavior and consumption, if I were to say a big part of American consumption is, say, QSR, for example, in India, the same thing could be grocery. A lot of us are betting on the fact that grocery, as GDP per capita goes up, will convert into eating out in restaurants and QSR and the likes. Do you think the pace of consumption is going to continue to grow like it has in the last decade?
In India in particular?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I think what happens typically with the growth of the middle class, and you can define the middle class on all kinds of ways, but with the growth of increased, let's say, prosperity or a better spread of prosperity in the system, you do get consumption. It's the old story of you have a scooter, you buy a car. You buy a car, you buy a bigger car. You get a bigger car, you buy a second one. That consumption has to play out. When it stops playing out is when you get a concentration of wealth at a certain level. And you'll find if you've already got 4 cars, there isn't going to be a 5th car bought. If you've already got 4 TVs in your house, you're unlikely to buy a 5th one. So there is a change in consumption patterns as incomes increase beyond a point. But till you get to that point, and India is still on that journey, till you get to that point, you'll get pretty good expansion of consumption. The nature of things consumed may change. The perceived advantages of a luxury good may change. The willingness to pay more for quality and pricing may change, which you've already seen in India in the last 20 years. That, I think, could keep happening, but I don't think consumption won't keep growing for a while. The one thing that could impact consumption is insecurity. So if you create, if people get insecure about jobs or insecure about savings or insecure about their future, then that leads to a inward turn on consumption. That's got nothing to do with prosperity and growth. It's got to do with, the topic you started with about how do you feel about your future. So long as you're optimistic, you tend to be willing to spend.
When you're no longer optimistic, does the nature of consumption change or do you stop consuming?
A little bit of both. You might downtrade in prices. You might downtrade in some things. You may leave certain things that you feel were luxuries that you don't need to consume. Now, I'll give you a crazy example, but here in New York City, the day the stock market does well, if you go to the average upmarket restaurant here, you will find the price of wine purchased that day at dinner goes up. It's the same day.
Really?
And now if it goes down, you will find it has an impact. It's how people feel. Consumption is not just about your material need. That is true when you're at a lower income level. When you're at a higher income level, consumption is also about how you feel in your head. And that's very different.
So in times of uncertainty like today, by virtue of what's happening in geopolitics and stock markets having corrected, if I were to correlate that not just in America and wine prices, do you think...
I gave you that to show you how crazy it can be.
Do you think in India, for example, the real estate market will follow the stock market? Will purchase of high-end cars go down?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think that India is still at a stage where the optimism of its population in terms of the future of India, in terms of its growth potential, and therefore their belief that they will have a better life than their parents. I still think India is going through that growth phase. And so you may have ups and downs. I cannot predict either stock or real estate prices anywhere. I gave up that long back. If I could do that, I would be doing something completely different.
Right.
But I think you can't predict short-term changes or even medium-term. But if you look at the trajectory, I don't think India has reached that point yet where its trajectory needs to be doubted in that sense. And if you look at the way India is building infrastructure, right, whether it's bridges, roads, airports, fixing up its port system, power, water systems, and so on. It's not that there isn't work to do. And it's not that there isn't more work to do. But it is very different from 25 years ago, 20 years ago. And without infrastructure, without healthcare, education, and skilling, you can't create the first foundational pillar of prosperity. Then you need the right governance and policies and rules and laws and regulations and transparency and all that. And then you need the financing for the private sector, small new entrepreneurs all the way to large companies. And then that's the process by which prosperity comes. And I think India is still doing pretty well on that trajectory.
So coming to what is the World Bank, Ajay? I'm a little bit of a fan of history. When I was younger, I spent a lot of time on the Second World War and German history. If one were to say that the World Bank was created post-World War II because rich, developed countries arrived at the conclusion that instability is generally a symptom of things not working well in economics, and giving money to poorer country makes the world more stable, which in turn prevents war. Would you say that's why the World Bank in a way was created?
So the original creation was the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, IBRD.
Right.
And that's the Bretton Woods thing you hear about. That actually got created to help rebuild Europe and Japan after the Second World War. And so it was a way to they weren't really thinking about the developing world at that time, because remember at that time, these areas of Europe and Japan had been decimated by the war.
Right.
And so this started for that. In fact, interestingly enough, the bullet trains of Japan were financed by the World Bank. Nuclear power plants in France were financed by the World Bank early on. By the time 15, 20 years went away from the end of the war, so you're in the early 60s, it became pretty clear that Europe and Japan were back into a rebuilding and growth phase. And attention began to focus into the rest of the world, in the so-called emerging world at that time. And more parts of the bank got created, one called the International Development Association, IDA, which caters for what is the poorest countries on the planet. Today, 78 countries are in that category. And essentially the difference between that and the IBRD is that those countries get 1/3 roughly of the money we give is free, no repayment of interest or principal. Whereas IBRD is closer to commercial market terms, but the concessionality of IBRD comes from the fact that you give long-term loans, longer than what you could get from a bank or from markets in your country. The third thing that got created was the International Finance Corporation. That goes to the private sector and enables the private sector to invest by de-risking in emerging market stuff. India is a classic example of that. Most people don't know, but HDFC originally started with an IFC investment.
Right.
And today is your largest private bank and has got an enormous footprint both in mortgages and helped to create the mortgage market in some ways in India, but also did a great job in the private banking side of financial services. And then the fourth part that got created was MIGA, the Multilateral Insurance Guarantee Agency. And the idea there is to provide political risk insurance to a company or an entrepreneur, that even if a government makes you a commitment that they don't live by it, could you go for an arbitration and get settlement? So we do both insurance guarantees through MIGA and then the arbitration through ICSID, which is our settlement of investor disputes on the fifth part, which settles between sovereigns and investors. So think about the bank as having 5 parts. And only the first part started soon after the Second World War.
Right.
Then came these add-ons over time. And today, when you step back and look at the totality, it's $120 billion that gets put into the marketplace every year. There's about 25,000, 30,000 people working across the world on this. And it runs the full gamut from the poorest countries getting 1/3 of money as grants all the way to the middle-income countries like IBRD, like India. India was an IDA country once upon a time and now is a donor to IDA.
Right.
Turkey, China, South Korea were all IDA countries, now donors. IBRD is still what India does get, but India is pivoting more and more towards the private sector with IFC and MIGA. And so you can see the evolution of growth in countries through the manner in which the bank deals with them. It's quite interesting.
So if I were to say the biggest chunk of the money flowing through World Bank, does it go to IFC? I have some numbers saying 70 billion to IFC, 40 billion to IDA.
No, so the way it goes every year, you got that you're counting private sector capital as well, mobilization. You look at the 120 I talked about 35 to 40 comes from IBRD.
Okay.
About 35 comes from IDA. Now, it depends on the year, right? So let's say 70 to 80 is coming from the public sector part of the institution. About 30 comes from, 25 to 30 comes from IFC. MEGA has 15 odd billion that it mobilizes. That's your 120. But if you also add private capital mobilization, like last year we mobilized 70 billion almost of private capital, up from say 40 billion 2-3 years ago.
Is this
That's not in this number.
Is this private capital chasing a return?
Yes, it is. So the real issue is it's a risk-reward relationship. Like in my old job at MasterCard,
Right.
I took decisions to invest capital in a country or an economy based on my risk-reward calculation, right? So does every investor, whether you're a hedge fund or you're a, furniture manufacturer.
Right.
Right? And so in a sense, you're looking for that. The question really is, if I can buy down your risk in some way, or I can create the opportunity for you to feel more confident about the return you're likely to make, then that's a risk you'll play with. Hence, IFC's one of its jobs is to help you reduce that risk perception. The second is why MEGA gets you the insurance guarantee. And the third is, if you get into a dispute with the sovereign, can I help you? Those
Right.
three together create the platform for a private sector player to be able to invest for return in these places.
And these guys are not coming in as equity partners, but as debt partners. You raise a bond and they...
You can also do equity. We do actually. So
Right.
IFC used to do a much more equity back pre the financial crisis.
Right.
During the financial crisis, they pivoted towards more debt than equity. And I'm in the process currently of pivoting to a balance between equity and debt where maybe we'll end up at 25-75. 25% to the investment going into equity, 75 into debt. That's not where we are today. We're lower than that in equity terms today. But my belief is that equity runs the whole gamut, and I'm not talking about investing only in large projects. I'm very keen to provide equity to small and medium and micro enterprises, because that's where the jobs come from. And you started our conversation by talking about jobs. And
Right.
we'll come to that.
Yeah.
But young people, entrepreneurs, they need a certain kind of capital, a certain kind of equity as well. Most of them don't have equity to start with. Women in particular don't have equity to start with. And so if I'm going to try and use a development bank rather than a commercial enterprise as the methodology of trying to drive jobs, then you have to start thinking about the impact you want to have on the ground for people who haven't got the opportunity that they could have got had they just gone to the private market. My
Right.
job is not to compete with the private market. My job is to create additionality,
Right.
right? And do it differently.
And I read somewhere that most of the capital is actually repaid. Can you attribute a IRR to the different buckets?
Yeah, although we don't discuss that for a reason.
Right.
We're basically profitable across the institution. The part of the bank that we don't need capital injections every year or 3 years. We don't need money for our administrative expenses every year or 3 years. And the reason for that is because of the fact that we don't actually have to worry about the fact that we lose money. We don't actually. So the part of the bank that isn't that way is IDA, where, as I told you, 1/3 of the money gets given away
Right.
every year. The moment you do that, that's a melting ice cream cone, right? You're going to end up with having to refinance that. We have a AAA rating. So we can go to the private bond markets and raise very attractive priced money, long tenor, which allows us to do the work we do at better prices than others.
This is like 3-4%.
Oh, we can raise money at anything from, depending on the interest rates of the time, at 2.5 all the way up to higher than that, depending on what you're raising it for.
So if I have to summarize in really layman terms, World Bank is a place where developed countries are giving money to poor countries, plus there is leverage because of your rating and you're able to raise money from bonds and private capital as well.
Yeah, so a part of it, you're right, the part about the developed countries going to the developing world.
Yeah.
That's the IDA part.
Yeah.
The rest is it goes into capital and retained earnings with us, which we leverage up through the bond market, which is mostly, I would say, about 60% private money, as in insurance companies and pension funds and asset managers. But 40% could be central banks parking reserves into bonds and the like as well.
And what is the point of the World Bank, Ajay, if you have to simplify to somebody who has no context?
Make jobs for young people, create jobs, help to do that. It's very simple. It's to kill poverty,
Right.
right? That's the idea. Get rid of poverty. The best way to get rid of poverty, the best way to put a nail in the coffin of poverty is to give somebody a job. Because then you get not only the earnings that allow them to subsist and have a family and care for them, but you get them hope and optimism. You will hear me talk about hope and optimism as a very important driver of human behavior. And a job gives you that. And the moment a job doesn't mean working for somebody. It could also be being an entrepreneur. It could be a small farmer. It could be a large entrepreneur. It could be someone with a successful business like yours, or it could be somebody who's working like me for somebody else. It doesn't matter. The idea of having earnings is what I'm talking about.
When I think about poverty and income inequality, it almost appears to me like the world does have enough. The distribution of what the world already has is not equal, and hence there is poverty and there is excess on the other side. Do you think that's right?
Yeah, I don't think like that, because I think you're looking at a utopian system where somehow you could wave a magic wand and take from Peter to feed Paul. And I'd be a little careful about that thinking. Right? That's not the way I believe. I believe that what creates wealth, first of all, is entrepreneurship and the private sector. I believe government's role is to create the infrastructure and the ability and the human capital and the rules and governance that enable the private sector to create jobs. I mean, 85 to 90% of jobs in the world are created in some form or the other in the private sector or in private sector-oriented enterprises in the state-owned sector. Right? That's kind of how this happens. And most of those are created with medium and small and micro enterprises. And so that cycle, that virtuous cycle of enabling these people to succeed so all of us can also be that way, I think that's an important thing to remember. So I don't believe that the way to think about this is if you can redistribute all the wealth, it'll be fine.
Right.
I just think you need to find a way to not lower the water in the river, but to actually raise the water in the river so boats can float higher.
No, I'm with you. I'm capitalistic as well. But if I was reading a bit about Bretton Woods and why the meeting was called upon and the 44 people who came in, I think even if you don't attribute what was the outcome to Keynes or Keynesian way of economics, I think he had a large part in how it was conceived.
Yeah.
Do you think the John Maynard Keynes model, where the government comes in to stabilize by spending money, will always have a trickle-down effect from the top, where the top of every ecosystem gets more of that money that is being printed or thrown into an economy?
Not really. Again, so if you look back over time, I think what happens is when interest rates go down, the reality is that capital benefits in terms of its returns for the next few years, and labor gets a lower share of the outcomes in that period. Now, why does that actually happen? Is because what happens when interest rates are going down is it's reflective of complicated economic dynamics. When there are complicated economic dynamics, businesses are less predictable. And people start getting, reduced number of jobs, layoffs happen, businesses constrict before they're able to, again, put money back to work and come out of the cycle and grow again. And at that time, therefore, capital gets an outsized return and labor gets a lower return. There are cycles in this system overall. And in that process, you will find the Gini coefficient in countries will change, which is kind of what you're getting at. But those cycles do change as well.
Right.
And, if you look at the way inequality in the world has gone, in fact, in the last 15, 20 years, it has increased because of this exact reason. Very low interest rates for a long period of time has created this kind of growth of capital return. Those who have money have made even more, and those who haven't have had to find their way through it. And that's the issue.
At the very core, if I have to simplify the idea, I could say that as long as wage price growth doesn't keep up with asset price inflation, inequality is bound to continue to go up.
That's the capital versus labor thing. Exactly correct.
Considering where the world is right now, it does not look like governments across the world can afford to raise interest rates beyond a certain point. And say the World Bank, for instance, is putting top-down money into different economies, which are again kind of saturating in the top and not really trickling down to the bottom in a fair manner. Why do we then make the case for income inequality really going down over the next decade or two?
600 million people in Africa don't have electricity today. And I don't mean inadequate electricity. None. Black. No electricity. What I'm talking about is not giving them one light, one fan with a solar cell on their roof. That to me is useful for quality of life, basic, but not useful for productive use. We're talking about productive use of energy. And so we've committed to connect 300 million people with the African Development Bank by 2030. As of June, we would be at 50 already. We got a line of sight to 200 or so. We'll find our way to, if not 300, 250. That would be 2.5 times what we connected in the last 10 years. That's not only at the top. That's going right to the people who want to set up a barber shop or a chicken hatchery or a farmer. You see what I mean? And so actually our money doesn't go to the top of the pyramid. Our money is being oriented towards this or healthcare. We're talking about getting 1.5 billion people access to better primary healthcare by 2030. Again, by this middle of this year, we would be at 400 million. Now, what does that mean by primary healthcare? A clinic near you where you can go where there's a nurse, a medical diagnostic technician, and a midwife. So you can actually, with technology, get access to a doctor who may be remote. गांव में नहीं है, but he's there, shared by 20 गांव के बीच में, मंडी में बैठा है, right? Think of it that way.
Right.
And that guy can be reached through that technology. You're the nurse, I walk in, I show you a rash, you look at it and say, I don't know what this is, but you can take a photograph of it, and between simple AI and the doctor, you can conclude whether it's an eczema, give me an ointment and send me home, or give me an appointment at a regional hospital because there's something about it that doesn't look good.
Right.
Things like that, or a farmer who can use this to be able to think about, which I'm doing in the case of agriculture for small farmers, giving them tools in UP. In fact, if you Google what I was doing back with in UP last year, this is what I was doing. Going to farmers who have set up cooperatives, and technology can be used with a Google Open platform, where you can use that technology to tell an illiterate farmer what that disease is at the back of a leaf. Forget the name, but what insecticide do you need? That's available for 25 rupees with your cooperative. So what I'm trying to get at is, our money in that question doesn't actually go to the top of the pyramid. We don't do much financing of large companies.
Right.
We're much more focused on